The ledger did not know it was lying. It only knew columns: date, sex, color, mother, value. On a damp morning in 1853, an overseer somewhere in the Deep South dipped his pen, hesitated for a heartbeat, and then wrote a word that did not match the child in front of him. Under color, where the law said any baby born to an enslaved woman should be marked black or mulatto, he wrote instead a single word: white. That one stroke of ink did two things at once. It erased the baby's mother from the future and created a paper child who would grow up believing a story about themselves that the ledger had invented. On most plantations, birth was not a mystery. Enslaved women's pregnancies were watched, counted, even calculated into profit projections. Children born in the cabins meant more labor in a few years, more bodies in the fields, more value in the owner's ledgers. The system treated new life as a balance sheet event. That is why unexplained white babies in slave quarters were never truly unexplained. They were officially inexplicable, but practically obvious. Every adult on the plantation understood how such a child had come into the world. The only real question was what the people in power would choose to do about it. The appearance of a pale-skinned infant in a row of cabins posed a specific kind of threat. Legally, the rule was simple: partus sequitur ventrum. The child follows the condition of the mother. No matter how white a baby looked, if the law recorded the mother as enslaved, that baby was enslaved. This rule did a lot of work for the slave system. It guaranteed that the children of enslaved women would remain property even when the father was a free white man, even when everyone in the county could see the resemblance. But law and appearances are not the same thing. A child with skin as light as any planter's son, hair fine and pale, eyes a familiar shade of blue or gray, that kind of baby made the entire logic of the plantation suddenly, painfully, visible. It was proof that the boundary between the master's world and the world of the quarters was not a wall, but a wound. White visitors might notice. Neighbors might gossip. Wives might demand explanations. The child itself, as it grew, might become an intolerable reminder. So the ledger faced a problem. Telling the truth, black mother, suspiciously white child, meant admitting something the plantation's owner might prefer to treat as rumor. And yet, the baby existed. Babies need to be recorded. They need to be placed somewhere in the system. One way to solve this was brutal simplicity. Treat the infant as just another enslaved child, ignore the color, and hope the resemblance faded with time. Another way was even crueler. Sell the child away early so that the evidence was shipped downstream along with the body. But sometimes, as in the story suggested by that first stroke of ink, the people who controlled the books made a different choice. They altered the paper reality to match the life they wanted the child to lead, not the life the law prescribed. At first glance, it seems odd that an owner or overseer would want to mark such a baby as white. The rule of slavery made mixed-race children profitable. Why give up an asset? The answers varied, but they shared a core logic: embarrassment, inheritance, and opportunity. Embarrassment. A powerful white man might want to remove all visible evidence of his assaults on enslaved women from his immediate world. If the baby could be quietly transferred, on paper and in reality, into the category of orphaned white child raised elsewhere, the household tension decreased. Inheritance. In some cases, a planter, without legitimate heirs, might want to provide for his mixed-race children without formally acknowledging them as black. By arranging for them to be legally whitened, he could leave property to them in a way that his white relatives might accept, or at least be unable to challenge in court. Opportunity. Certain intermediaries, doctors, midwives, local officials, understood that a nearly white child with no documented black ancestry could be placed in white families, sometimes for a fee. Orphanages, foundling hospitals, and child placement networks could turn a troublesome baby from the cabins into a future servant, apprentice, or even heir in a different county. In each scenario, the paper change did not arise from kindness. It arose from the needs of white adults to hide, to profit, or to manipulate family dynamics. The child's future whiteness was, in effect, a solution to a problem those adults had created. The process usually began far from the ledger, in the tense days and nights after a birth. In an enslaved community, news traveled faster than the overseer's horse. Women who helped each other give birth saw the baby's skin, noted the hair texture, exchanged glances. They weighed the dangers of speaking and of staying silent. They knew that if a white child was discovered in the cabins, punishment might fall randomly: beatings, accusations of adultery, even sales as discipline. Sometimes a midwife or elder would take the initiative, wrap the baby, place it at the edge of the quarters, close enough that it would be found by someone white before the community was blamed for hiding it. Sometimes the mother herself made that choice, fighting between the instinct to hold her child and the knowledge that keeping it might doom them both. An overseer, summoned in the gray light before dawn, would arrive to find an infant apparently abandoned on a threshold or in an empty cabin. His first reaction, if we believe the dry language of plantation logs, was administrative shock. White babies were not supposed to be here. From that moment, the choreography depended on the personalities involved. The overseer might send the child directly to the master's house, forcing a conversation. The mistress of the plantation, confronted with the baby's face, might react with rage, grief, or cold strategy. A doctor, called to examine the child, might quietly confirm paternity or pretend ignorance. Behind closed doors, decisions were made. Should the baby be kept nearby and raised in some ambiguous status? Sent to relatives in another state? Deposited at a church door or orphanage with a note that concealed its origin? Whatever the answer, one thing was certain: a story had to be constructed to explain the child's appearance to the outside world, and that story would later be reflected in ink. Imagine again that overseer in 1853, pen hovering. The baby's actual circumstances might be something like this: mother, an enslaved woman in her 20s, recorded in the plantation inventory as Betty Negro, age 23. Father, almost certainly the master's eldest son or another white man in authority. Birthplace, cabin number 7, just before dawn after a hard labor attended by other enslaved women. The story that will go into the public record, however, cannot include those details. Perhaps the owner has decided that the child will be sent away to be reared as white. Perhaps a local couple who cannot have children has agreed to take the baby, as long as there is nothing on paper tying it to black ancestry. So the overseer opens a different book, not the slave register, but a miscellaneous ledger, or the orphanage intake form, or the county birth record. There he writes, male infant, race, white, parents unknown, found, at location sanitized, to be placed under care of white couples' names. Somewhere else, in the slave inventory, he may quietly leave a gap where Betty's child would have been listed, or write a vague note. Issue: dead at birth. The plantation's internal arithmetic adjusts without broadcasting what has happened. Two realities now coexist. In the lived memory of the cabins, there was a baby whose skin startled everyone, who was carried away and never returned. In the official records, there is a different baby entirely, a nameless white foundling with no mother, no father, and no past. That is what paper child means, a person whose documented origin is a deliberate fiction. For the enslaved women whose children were whitened this way, the pain was double. They suffered the original violation that produced the pregnancy. Assaults framed as relations with men who owned their labor and often their very bodies. Then, when the child arrived carrying the visible imprint of that abuse, they faced a choice with no good outcomes: keep the baby and live under the constant threat it represented, or let it be taken and erased. Even the softest version of the story, an owner who tells a woman, "Your child will have a better life as white," contains cruelty. The promise is built on the premise that staying with the mother is unthinkable. Whiteness, in this equation, is a gift that demands separation. The mother's presence is treated as a contaminant. In letters and diaries, some white mistresses mention these situations obliquely. A strange child sent away, a husband's indiscretion handled quietly, a servant relieved of a burden. The mother's voices are absent. They did not have the power to write themselves into those documents. Yet, they remembered. Oral histories collected generations later include stories of white-looking babies taken from the quarters, of songs sung about children lost to the big house, of whispered guesses about neighbors who looked too much like the former master's family. Those memories never made it into official ledgers. The ledgers belonged to the people who benefited from forgetting. In modern retellings, stories about white babies in slave cabins are often packaged as mysteries. No one could explain how they got there. Plantation owners were baffled. The truth they finally uncovered shocked everyone. But for anyone who lived inside the system, the pattern was obvious. White men abused their power. Children were born. Those children threatened the fragile fiction of racial separation. Paper solutions were devised. The real mystery is not how the babies appeared. It is how thoroughly their true origins were hidden, so that a century and a half later, their descendants might have no idea where they came from. The first chapter of this story, then, is not about solving a puzzle. It is about watching the puzzle being deliberately constructed, how a society that worshipped clear racial lines dealt with the bodies that crossed them. In the chapters that follow, the focus will widen beyond a single plantation. We will trace how foundlings, orphanages, midwives, judges, and clerks formed a quiet network for turning flesh and blood children into white entries on paper, and how, in our own time, those decisions echo in DNA tests and family secrets that refuse to stay buried. The second time the baby changed hands, nobody wrote anything down at all. There were no ledgers, no official forms, no neat columns of ink, just a hurried exchange behind a church, a whispered lie about a poor white girl who died in childbirth, and a bundle passed from the arms of a black woman who had nursed the child to the arms of a white woman who would raise it as her own. By the time the infant finally appeared on paper again, baptized in a new name, in a new county. Its journey from slave cabin to respectable cradle had been washed clean. Only the women who had carried it knew the route. And they were not the ones history listened to. If the first chapter was about the moment the ledger lied, this chapter is about everything that happened in the shadows between those lines of ink. Turning a mixed-race baby, born to an enslaved mother, into a white child in a different household was not a single act. It was a chain of quiet decisions, some made out of fear, some out of calculation, some out of a twisted sense of mercy. Each link in that chain involved real people: mothers, overseers, midwives, priests, matrons in orphanages, childless couples, local officials. None of them would have described themselves as running a whitening network, but that is what, collectively, they created. The first movement, out of the quarters. The journey almost always began at night or at dawn, when the risk of being seen was lowest. In many cases, the enslaved mother did not choose the moment of removal. A mistress, furious at the living proof of her husband's betrayal, might order that the baby be taken away at once. An overseer, terrified that rumors would explode if the child stayed in the cabins, might decide preemptively to get it off the place. A master, unwilling to confront the infant that mirrored his own features, might give curt orders to send it somewhere it won't cause trouble. But sometimes the initiative came from the enslaved community itself. Women who had seen what happened to other light-skinned children, punished, sold, or used as objects of abuse in the big house, might decide that the only chance for this infant was to be smuggled out before the master gave it a number in his inventory. A grandmother or friend taking the baby under her shawl could slip it to someone trusted beyond the plantation fence. Whatever the motive, the pattern was similar. The baby was wrapped in whatever cloth was available, sometimes a flour sack, sometimes a cast-off dress cut and resewn, sometimes a deliberately better garment meant to signal white ownership. The mother might be allowed a last embrace or might be kept away, for fear she would refuse to let go. A small group of adults, enslaved, free black, poor white, or some mixture, carried the infant away from the row of cabins toward the next stage of its reinvention. At that moment, the child's legal identity was still fixed by the law, the offspring of an enslaved woman. But socially, it was already being detached from the world of its birth. Across the South, particularly in areas where plantations sat near towns, roads, and churches, there existed a web of informal connections that made these transfers possible. Some participants were themselves enslaved but had unusual mobility. Wagon drivers, who traveled between estates, domestic servants who accompanied their owners into town, nurses who moved between white households. Others were free but precarious, midwives who attended births of both races, laundresses who worked in multiple homes, small-town shopkeepers who saw everyone's comings and goings. Because they occupied liminal spaces, neither fully inside the planter elite nor entirely outside it, these people often became the couriers of delicate problems. They knew who had recently lost a baby, who had been quietly trying to adopt, which clergyman was sympathetic, which orphanage could take in a child with no questions asked. No one called it a system, yet in practice it functioned like one. A white planter could say to a trusted intermediary, "Find a place for this child," and reasonably expect that, within weeks, the baby would be gone, and a new story in place to explain its whereabouts. The routes varied, from plantation to town midwife, then to a church, then to an orphanage, from the quarters directly to a childless white couple across the county line. From the big house to a relative in another state, where the child would arrive as an orphaned niece or distant cousin's boy. At each handoff, people made choices about what to reveal. This baby's mama died. The mother couldn't keep it. The parents are poor and asked us to place the child with good Christian folk. The one thing almost never mentioned in these stories was the word slave. By the mid-19th century, many southern towns had some form of foundling home, orphan asylum, or church-run refuge for abandoned children. Officially, these institutions existed to save infants from infanticide, to rescue them from the streets, and to offer them at least a chance at life. In practice, they also became nodes where inconvenient children could be dropped off and redistributed. A pale baby with ambiguous origins might be left on the steps in the night, wrapped neatly with a vague note. Mother dead. Please care for him. The matron who found it at dawn would record the child as foundling race white if its features fit local expectations. There was rarely a rigorous investigation into whether the story was true. The system was built on haste and volume, not forensic precision. Some of these homes operated on a semi-formal farm-out system. They would place children with families willing to feed and clothe them in exchange for their labor as they grew. Others facilitated informal adoptions, especially for very young infants who could more easily be treated as the birth child of a new mother. For a baby like the one from the slave cabin, this environment offered cover. Hundreds of children passed through such places, their origins blurred. The matron's notes might be the only written trace of where the child came from. And even those notes could be destroyed, misplaced, or corrected later. The irony is pointed. Institutions founded on Christian charity ended up smoothing the path for a system that required certain children to forget their mothers in order to belong. On the other end of the process were white couples, for whom a baby represented hope, status, or salvation. Infant mortality was high. Not every marriage produced children. In communities where a woman's value was often tied to motherhood, childlessness could be a heavy stigma. An adopted child, especially a baby young enough to pass as a birth child, could restore a sense of normalcy, quiet gossip, and secure future labor or inheritance. When such couples came looking, they rarely wanted complexity. They wanted a story they could repeat at church and in family circles without attracting scrutiny. We took in my sister's child after she died. A widow in town couldn't keep her baby. We adopted from the orphanage. The origin of the child's skin tone was crucial. A much-desired baby with any sign of African ancestry, however faint, was far less likely to be accepted. This created a grim selection pressure. The whiter the enslaved mother's child looked, the more likely it was to be offered to white couples as a solution for their grief. Adoption in this era seldom involved detailed paperwork. A minister's blessing, a note from the orphanage, a verbal agreement, that was often enough. Once the child was in its new home, time did the rest. Neighbors grew used to its presence. The story hardened. This was always the Hendersons' daughter, or the Carters' adopted boy from somewhere in the hills. The baby's first world, the cabins, the women who had held it through fevered nights, the mother whose body still ached from birth, faded into a silence never written down. Not everyone involved in these transfers was indifferent. Some enslaved women, watching a white couple carry off a child they had nursed, might have felt a complicated mix of pain and bitter hope that their baby, raised as white, might at least be spared the whip and the auction block. That feeling was not consent. It was an adaptation to a world that offered them no way to keep both their children and their sanity intact. Some white midwives and small-town priests, confronted with obvious mixed ancestry, might have struggled with their own conscience. They knew the racial codes. They could see the curve of a nose, the texture of hair. Yet they also knew what life as colored would mean in that society. When they wrote white on a baptismal certificate, or signed an orphanage intake form without asking questions, they might have told themselves they were giving the child a chance. They were also, whether they admitted it or not, participating in a system that protected white men's reputations and erased black women's motherhood. There were likely rare cases where someone refused: a doctor who insisted on recording the mother's name, a clergyman who refused to baptize under a lie. Those people often paid social costs. Planters took their business elsewhere. Couples sought out more accommodating institutions. Over time, the path of least resistance became a well-worn road. Don't ask, don't write, don't remember. As the paper child grew, its identity was braided from what adults chose to say and what they carefully withheld. A girl might grow up hearing a single polished story about her origin. Your mama was an angel who died when you were born. You were left on the steps of the church and God brought you to us. We chose you. That's all that matters. Questions about resemblance, why she looked more like the neighbor's family than her own, why older people in the black part of town sometimes stared at her with a strange intensity, were smoothed over with jokes or scoldings. Family Bibles, if they recorded her at all, might list her under the same parents as biological children, with no mark of adoption. County records would treat her as simply white, especially once she married and had children of her own. Each new document layered more proof on top of the original lie. By adulthood, the gap between lived experience and paper identity was total. Her world, as far as she knew, began at the front door of the White House, where she took her first steps. The cabin where she drew her first breath did not exist in any record she could access. Meanwhile, in the enslaved quarters or the freed black neighborhoods that formed after emancipation, there was a different kind of remembering. Women told hushed stories about babies who had been taken to be white. They might point out a family in town. Their great-grandmama used to live right here, but now they don't claim us. These stories rarely made it into newspapers or official histories, but they circulated as oral maps of loss. The community bore that loss in concrete ways. Mothers aged faster under grief. Siblings grew up with a sense that the world could snatch away anyone for reasons they did not control. A pervasive, generational mistrust formed toward institutions that claimed to act for the child's good, but always on white terms. When emancipation came, and people tried to reconnect scattered family members, paper children were often the hardest to find. Slave sale records could sometimes be tracked. Names changed in marriage could sometimes be followed. But infants who had been whitened and adopted left almost no trail. They were missing pieces in family trees, lost at birth, given away. We don't know what happened. The pain of that absence stayed local, unacknowledged in broader narratives about slavery and its aftermath. From the vantage point of the 19th century, the erasure looked successful. the paper children survived and blended into whiteness. Their descendants inherited land, privilege, and a story of origin that began with a foundling tale rather than a slave cabin. The people who had orchestrated the process aged, died, and were buried with their secrets. What they could not foresee was that, generations later, two forces would begin to pry open the silence: archival research and cheap genetic testing. Old orphanage ledgers, once collecting dust, would be digitized. Church records would be indexed. Marginal notes and odd gaps in plantation inventories would catch the eyes of historians who knew what patterns to look for. At the same time, ordinary people curious about their ancestry would start mailing saliva to laboratories and receiving back percentages that did not match the stories they had been told. The child whitened on paper would, through descendants, send a different message in code: markers of African ancestry, clusters of unexpected cousins, matches to families from counties where no one remembered any black kin. The next chapters of this story belong to that collision between paper and blood. For now, Chapter 2 ends in the quiet decades when the system still believed its own lies, when the routes from cabin to cradle remained uncharted, and the paper children grew up, never suspecting that the first journey of their lives had already rewritten who they were allowed to be. The judge didn't know. He was looking at a ghost. All he saw was a neatly dressed young man standing in his courtroom in 1912, asking to be recognized as the lawful heir of a dead landowner. The boy's skin was pale, his manners polished, his paperwork in order: baptismal record, school certificate, a will that mentioned him by name. On the surface, everything about him said white. But as the lawyers argued and old neighbors were called to testify, a second story kept trying to surface: whispers about a slave cabin, an overseer's ledger with a missing entry, a baby that had disappeared half a century earlier. The court had to answer a question its own system had created. When a lie is old enough to feel like truth, which story wins, paper or blood? By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, many of the children who had been moved from cabins to white cradles were adults. They married, worked, voted, bought land, paid taxes, and raised families. On the surface, they were indistinguishable from any other white citizens in their towns. Their identities felt solid, backed by birth certificates, baptismal records, and family stories. But paper doesn't forget how it was written, and occasionally, under pressure, during lawsuits, inheritance fights, criminal cases, that carefully constructed whiteness had to be defended. Those moments reveal how the system of whitening children depended not just on private decisions, but on the active participation of professionals: doctors, priests, county clerks, and judges who were willing to turn obvious questions into officially settled facts. In the decades after the Civil War, states gradually standardized birth registration. What had once been a patchwork of church records and family Bibles turned into official forms. On those forms, someone, usually a doctor, sometimes a midwife, had to mark the child's race. For most births, the choice was routine. The parents' status and community perception lined up. But when the origins of a child were more complicated, the person holding the pen became a gatekeeper. A doctor who had lived through slavery might recognize certain family names, remember which plantations had a reputation for white children in the cabins. He might see a baby whose features did not match the story the parents offered. Yet he was also part of a culture that prized whiteness and saw it as a ticket to safety, and opportunity. Faced with a pale infant presented as white by white guardians, many physicians chose not to dig. They filled in the race box according to the social script in the room, not the unrecorded history behind it. In small towns, where everyone knew everyone else's business, this often meant cooperating with a shared pretense. Midwives, especially black midwives in the South, were often in a different position. They knew the family's secrets more intimately. They had delivered babies in both cabins and respectable parlors. Some, loyal to the mothers they served, might insist on recording the truth in their own notes, even if those notes never made it to the courthouse. Others, under economic and social pressure, learned when to keep quiet and let the official version stand. Either way, the medical profession became the first stop where a paper identity could be built or reinforced without open conflict. If the doctor set the first seal on whiteness, the county clerk applied the second. Clerks were the bureaucratic memory of a community. Their offices contained birth registers, marriage licenses, deed books, voter rolls. They had the power to normalize a fiction simply by writing it down and indexing it under the right letter. When an adopted or placed-out child reached adulthood and came to the courthouse to get a marriage license or register land, the clerk didn't look into their genes. He looked at the documents already in the system. If the earlier entries said white, that was usually the end of the discussion. In rare cases, however, contradictions surfaced. A land dispute might send a clerk back into older volumes, where he found an enslaved woman's name connected to a birth around the time a now prominent family's patriarch was mysteriously taken in as a child. A criminal investigation might lead an official to compare plantation ledgers with later county records and notice a suspicious gap. A voter registration challenge might prompt political enemies to dig into a rival's ancestry looking for proof of colored blood. When such inconsistencies arose, the clerk had choices: quietly ignore them, lose the inconvenient document, or escalate the issue to a judge. The very fact that so many whitened identities survived uncontested tells us how often the first two options won. Religious institutions added another layer of validation. Baptism and membership rolls served as moral passports. Being listed as a communicant in a white church, married at its altar, and buried in its cemetery solidified a person's place in the community. For a child whose beginnings lay in a slave cabin, being baptized as white was more than a ritual. It was a rewriting of origin in the eyes of God and neighbors alike. The priest or minister who performed the sacrament lent spiritual authority to the new identity. Most clergy did not ask for proof. They relied on what the family presented. If a couple brought a baby and said, "This is our child," the church generally took them at their word. Doubts might circulate informally, whispers in pews, sidelong glances at the child's features. But few pastors wanted to ignite scandal by publicly challenging a parishioner's racial claim. In racially segregated congregations, this meant that some people with partial African ancestry sat in white pews unmolested, while others with similar ancestry worshipped in separate black churches, their status never questioned because it fit expectation. Church walls, like courthouse walls, reflected social power more than genetic truth. Most of the time, the fiction held. But in some communities, especially in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, conflicts erupted that forced courts to decide: was a particular person legally white or not? These so-called race cases were brutal. Neighbors and relatives were summoned to testify about skin tones, hair textures, family rumors. Old records were exhumed. Judges listened to arguments about fractions of ancestry, one-drop rules, and the intent of segregation laws. In many instances, the stakes were enormous. The right to vote, to attend certain schools, to marry a particular spouse, to inherit property. For someone who had grown up believing they were white, such a challenge could feel like the ground dropping away. Imagine being told in adulthood, in a crowded courtroom, that your entire identity is under question because someone has evidence that your great-grandmother was classified differently in a long-forgotten ledger. Lawyers on one side would point to the existing paper trail, a birth certificate marked white, decades of voting records, membership in white organizations. Lawyers on the other side might produce a plantation inventory, a bill of sale, or testimony from an elderly witness who remembered a scandal. Judges, steeped in the racial logic of their time, rarely sided with those seeking to cross from colored into white. But when the direction was reversed, when someone already accepted as white stood accused of having black ancestry, the outcomes were inconsistent. Some courts clung to the one-drop rule and stripped people of their whiteness on thin evidence. Others, wary of destabilizing local elites, chose to accept paper whiteness as definitive and dismiss challenges as malicious. In both kinds of cases, the underlying injustice was the same. The law claimed authority over a person's entire social existence based on categories it had itself constructed and manipulated for generations. The economic uses of whitened heirs' inheritance brought the most sensitive and revealing conflicts. Planters who had quietly whitened a mixed-race child on paper sometimes went further, leaving them land, money, or businesses. They might write a will that named the child without mentioning race, trusting that the existing records would be enough to shield them. Or they might explicitly describe the heir as "my beloved adopted son," subtly distinguishing him from acknowledged biological children while still providing for him. When such a will came to probate, white relatives who felt cheated had powerful incentives to attack the heir's racial status. If they could convince a court that the heir was actually black by descent, laws in many southern states would either void the inheritance or restrict it severely. Overnight, a young man or woman who had lived as white might find their legal identity weaponized against them, not because the community suddenly cared about historical accuracy, but because money was at stake. In these battles, whiteness functioned like a key to a safe. If the key could be snapped in the lock, others could grab the contents. The irony is sharp. The same racial system that had once benefited from keeping such children enslaved now produced a second round of cruelty by questioning their right to enjoy the status it had conferred on them earlier for convenience. The quiet cases that never reached court. For every spectacular lawsuit, there were countless smaller confrontations resolved in hallways, back rooms, and threats. A local politician might hint to a rival, "We wouldn't want rumors about your grandmother to spread before the election, would we?" A banker, considering a loan, might glance twice at a customer's features and ask a few too curious questions about family background, knowing that the answers could be used to justify denial if needed. A white suitor's parents might discover documents that persuaded them to forbid a marriage without ever taking the matter to a judge. In these private arenas, paper and rumor interacted in complex ways. Sometimes, The mere existence of official documents was enough to shut down gossip. Look, here's the birth certificate. End of discussion. Other times, no amount of paperwork could silence malicious talk once someone decided to weaponize ancestry. The people most vulnerable in these situations were those whose whiteness rested on the thinnest documentary foundation. Foundlings, informally adopted children, people whose early records were sparse or missing. The system that had earlier guaranteed their safety by calling them white could at any moment turn around and say, "Prove it." The emotional cost of living as a paper person. For the individuals caught in this web, the psychological toll was heavy, even when no public challenge arose. Some felt an unnamed stress around questions of origin. Family stories didn't quite add up. Older relatives changed the subject when the past came up. A dark-eyed cousin nobody talked about. A box of letters that accidentally burned. A stiff awkwardness whenever discussions of race entered the room. Others suspected more directly. Perhaps a grandparent had hinted at mixed blood or a scandal back in slavery days. They might notice that their features matched those of black families in town more closely than those of their own declared kin. Without documentation, such suspicions floated, unanchored, shaping self-perception without solid proof. Some carried a kind of survivor's guilt once they learned the truth, realizing that the privileges they enjoyed were built on a carefully maintained lie, while their unknown cousins lived under the weight of discrimination the same system had designed for them. But for most of the 20th century, these feelings had nowhere to go. The tools to investigate deeply were limited. Archives were scattered and often hostile to black researchers. Genealogical societies focused primarily on respectable white lineages. DNA analysis was decades away. The paper children and their descendants lived in a strange limbo, their identities both fragile and enforced, threatened by rumors yet protected by documents no one wanted to question too closely. By the end of this chapter, the picture should be clear. What we call whitening on paper was not a one-time plantation trick. It was a process that reached from birth rooms to orphanages, from church fonts to courthouse desks, from wills to whispered threats. It turned some children of enslaved women into legally white adults, and then spent decades defending or selectively attacking that whiteness, whenever money, status, or politics required. For a long time, the written record had the last word. Ledgers, certificates, and court rulings defined reality. But paper was never the only archive. The other archive was biological, carried quietly in the cells of those who had been renamed, reassigned, and raised under false origins. In the next chapter, we move into the present, into living rooms where DNA results arrive by email, into online genealogy groups where strangers discover they share great-grandparents across a color line that was supposed to be unbreakable. There, the lies written in old ink collide with the data written in blood, and families are forced to decide which story they are finally willing to believe. The email didn't say, "Your family lied to you." It just showed numbers. On the screen, 78% European, 18% West African, a few percent scattered elsewhere. And below that, a list of close DNA matches, full of surnames the woman had never heard in her life. One cluster of matches, all traced back to a single county in Alabama, a place her parents swore their people had never lived. When she clicked through to their family trees, she saw something even stranger. The same great-grandfather's name appearing in both her line and theirs, split into white on one side and colored on the other. The paper story said they were strangers. Her blood said they were cousins. For more than a century, the system that whitened some children of enslaved women relied on one assumption: that the lies written in ledgers and certificates would outlive the people who knew the truth. Mothers would die, overseers and midwives would die, judges and priests would die, the paper would remain, and future generations would accept it as reality. Then a different kind of record started speaking. Cheap consumer DNA tests, marketed as fun genealogy toys, put genetic analysis in millions of homes. People spit into tubes for birthday gifts out of idle curiosity, or because they wanted to know if the family rumor about being part Irish was true. The companies behind these tests built vast databases of genetic information and began comparing everyone to everyone else. They were not designed to expose the history of paper children. But that is what they began to do. When numbers contradict the story, the first shock for many test takers comes in the form of an unexpected ancestry estimate. A man who grew up in a family proud of its pure European roots sees a significant percentage of African ancestry in his results. A woman raised in a black family with a long repeated story about Native American great-grandparents discovers that her genetic profile shows far more European and African ancestry than indigenous. The numbers alone don't tell the whole story, but they raise questions that decades of paper documents had successfully muted. On their own, percentages can be dismissed. The test must be wrong, some say. These are just estimates. It's when the match list appears, hundreds of names, some labeled close family, second cousin, third cousin, that denial becomes harder. People used to be able to think of ancestry as a private matter, controlled by what elders chose to reveal. DNA smashes that privacy by mapping connections across families who may never have heard of one another. When someone clicks on a match and sees a family tree populated with names from a county where their own grandparents once lived, but under a different racial classification, they begin to sense that the ledger might not have told the whole truth. For descendants of paper children, DNA matches can feel like messages from another timeline. They might discover a cluster of black or mixed-race families whose trees trace back to the same plantation, the same landowner, the same cluster of cabins described in half-remembered stories. One branch continued as enslaved or later as colored under Jim Crow. Another branch, descended from a baby whitened on paper, went on to be recorded as white, perhaps moving away, changing surnames, blending into a world that suddenly seems less self-contained than they thought. Conversations between these matches often unfold in stages. Surprise. I had no idea I had relatives who identify as black. Correlation. Wait, our great-grandfathers have the same name, and they lived in the same county at the same time. Deep dive. Old census records, wills, plantation ledgers, church books pulled from archives or online databases. Realization: the stories line up just enough to make denial uncomfortable. Some relatives embrace the connection. They begin to swap photos, compare facial features, trade family legends. Others back away, insisting that whatever the DNA says, they are just white or just black, and that revisiting the past will only stir up trouble. The genealogical evidence is rarely perfect. Slavery fractured records, names changed, children were nicknamed, sold, or hidden. But when multiple lines of evidence, DNA, place, names, oral histories, point in the same direction, a pattern emerges that looks very much like what Chapter 1 described. Babies whose paper lives began at a different address than their bones did. The emotional earthquake. Discovering that your family tree crosses a racial line that society has treated as absolute can produce a strange mix of emotions. For some white-presenting descendants, there is shame, a dawning awareness that their ancestors not only owned people, but may have fathered children with enslaved women, and then erased those children's ties to their mothers. There can also be grief, realizing that whole branches of kin were left behind under a system designed to oppress them, while another branch rose in status on a foundation of silence. For some black or mixed-race descendants, there is anger, confirmation that the rumors about white kin who don't claim us were true all along, that opportunities, land, and safety were funneled disproportionately to the branch that got whitened on paper, while the others bore the full weight of segregation and violence. There is also sometimes a complicated satisfaction. The system that tried so hard to separate these families left an unbreakable link inside their bodies. That link cannot be unwritten by a clerk, sold at auction, or burned in a courthouse fire. Yet not everyone who learns these truths wants to act on them. Some people close their accounts, delete their results, or simply decide to ignore what they've learned. Living with a fractured identity can feel more frightening than sticking with a comfortable lie. What archives add to what DNA begins? Genetic data opens the door. Archival work walks through it. Once people suspect a connection, they can turn to surviving records with new questions. Plantation inventories, baptismal books, manumission papers, orphanage intake logs, lawsuits over inheritance, all of these look different when you know you might be reading about your own ancestor, not a distant stranger. Researchers have begun to spot patterns, clusters of foundlings appearing in white institutions, near large plantations, at moments when records show light-skinned babies born in the slave quarters. Wills, in which a landowner leaves property to an adopted child whose age and appearance line up suspiciously well with rumors of mixed-race offspring. Sudden disappearances of infants from slave registers coinciding with the appearance of nameless white babies in local church records. Each piece alone can be explained away. Together they draw a map of the roots from cabin to cradle that Chapter 2 sketched in narrative form. For descendants, seeing those documents can be as powerful as seeing their DNA results. A name in an overseer's sloppy handwriting, or a note in an orphanage ledger. Child brought by unknown man, says Mother Dead, can feel like the first time an erased ancestor steps back into sight. The question of what to do with the truth. Knowing is one thing. Deciding how to live with what you know is another. Families faced with proof that their tree includes both enslavers and enslaved, both people who were whitened on paper and people left marked as black, have to navigate several difficult choices. What to tell children? Do you teach them from an early age that their ancestry crosses the old color lines, or let them absorb the simpler story the world expects and add complexity later? How to handle relatives who refuse to engage? Some will embrace the new information, others will insist on silence. Do you honor their wishes for family harmony, or insist that the truth be acknowledged? Whether to reach out? Do you try to build relationships with newly discovered cousins from the other side of the racial divide, knowing that the imbalance in historical experience may make those relationships tense. There is no single right answer. The risk of performative reconciliation, taking a few photos with distant relatives, and then going back to life as usual, is real. So is the risk of letting fear and shame keep everyone in their separate corners. What is clear is that the choice to know or not know is itself a form of privilege. The ancestors in the cabins had no such choice. The truth was written on their bodies and their babies' faces, whether anyone wanted to see it or not. From private revelation to public history. Beyond individual families, the convergence of DNA and archival research is slowly reshaping public narratives about slavery and race. Historians can now demonstrate, with data and case studies, what enslaved communities always knew, that racial categories were porous in practice, even as the law tried to freeze them. They can point to specific lines of descent where people legally classified as white and black today share great-grandparents. Museums and documentaries have started to include stories of paper children when explaining how slavery worked, not just as a system of labor, but as a system of sexual exploitation and identity management. School curricula are beginning, slowly, to acknowledge that many white Southern families have unacknowledged black kin, not as an accusation, but as a plain fact of how power operated. This shift matters because it undercuts one of the oldest myths in American culture, that racial lines are ancient, natural, and clear. The history of whitened babies shows those lines as recent, manufactured, and enforced precisely because biological reality refused to cooperate. The ledger's last word, and ours. At the start of this story, an overseer bent over a ledger and wrote a lie that turned an enslaved woman's child into a white infant on paper. For generations, that entry was treated as the truth. It shaped where the child lived, whom they married, which schools their descendants attended, which side of the bus they sat on, which neighborhoods they could safely walk through at night. Now, in labs far from those old plantations, machines read fragments of DNA and output different truths. They show that the lines drawn in ink do not match the lines woven through chromosomes. They expose the paper children as what they always were. Human beings caught between stories, their lives bent to serve the convenience of others. We cannot reopen the ledgers and write the mothers' names where they should have been. We cannot turn back the auctions or undo the generations of unequal treatment that followed. But we can refuse to let the lie be the final version. In the end, this is not just a story about ancestry kits or sensational revelations. It is about choosing which archive to honor. One archive sits in courthouses and church basements, built largely by people who held power and used it to protect themselves. The other lives in the bodies of their descendants, carrying traces of every union, consensual or forced, that the first archive tried to smooth over. When those two archives disagree, we are forced to decide who gets believed this time: the clerks who served a slave society, or the quiet testimony written in the descendants of those it tried to control. The paper children were created so that certain truths would disappear. The fact that you are hearing this story now means the disappearance was never complete. The question now is whether we will learn from the way those lies worked or build new ones on top of them.